Imagine working, building something, earning more money than you ever have before, and then losing almost all of it. Not half, not even most. 90%. For every $100 you make, you keep $10. The rest? Gone. Taken by the system. At first, it sounds extreme, unrealistic, but not impossible, because at different points in history, tax rates have gone that high. So what would actually happen? If we taxed 90% of income today, this is what if, and here's what would happen if we taxed 90% of income. At first, the idea sounds powerful, simple. If the highest earners give up more, the system becomes more balanced. Less inequality, more government funding, more support for public systems, healthcare, education, infrastructure, all funded at a higher level. And for most people, nothing changes, because the tax only applies to the highest levels of income, so it feels targeted, fair, even necessary. But income doesn't just sit still, it reacts. Because when you change how much people keep, you change how they behave, especially at the top, where most of that tax would apply. Because high income doesn't just come from working harder, it comes from decisions, deals, investments, ownership. And when those decisions become less rewarding, they start to change. At a 90% tax rate, earning more becomes less attractive, not impossible, but less meaningful. Because the difference between making more and making slightly less starts to shrink. So people begin to adjust. They delay income, restructure compensation, move money into assets instead of salary. Some move to lower tax regions. Others stop scaling at the same level. Not because they can't, but because the reward changes. And then there's business creation, because building something large requires long-term effort, risk, time, uncertainty. The possibility of high reward is what balances that risk. But when that reward is heavily reduced, fewer people take that path. Startups still exist, but fewer grow as aggressively. Fewer aim for massive scale, because the upside is no longer the same. There's also capital, because high earners don't just spend money, they invest it into companies, into markets, into expansion. If less income is available to reinvest, growth slows, not immediately, but gradually. Now scale this across the entire system. Less aggressive growth, more cautious expansion, slower decision-making. The system becomes more stable, but also less dynamic. Because extreme outcomes, both success and failure, start to shrink. And with that, so does momentum. And eventually, you start to see the shift. Fewer large companies emerging, fewer massive risks being taken, more predictability, but less innovation at the edges. Because the system begins to optimize for safety instead of scale. And over time, that safety becomes the default. Less volatility, less failure, but also fewer breakthroughs. Because the biggest leaps forward usually come from the biggest risks. And when those risks disappear, progress doesn't stop, but it slows. It becomes incremental, measured, controlled, and the system begins to favor what already works, instead of what could change everything. So what started as redistribution becomes a trade-off, more equality, in exchange for less extreme outcomes. And the system adjusts around that, because people don't just respond to rules, they respond to incentives. And incentives shape behavior at every level of the system, from individuals to businesses to entire economies. So when you compress the upside, you don't just reduce inequality, you reshape ambition itself. What people aim for, what they're willing to risk, what they believe is worth pursuing. And over time, that changes the direction of progress, not just how fast it moves, but where it goes. At this point, something else changes, power. Because income isn't just money, it's influence. And when high earners lose most of what they make, that influence doesn't disappear. It moves toward governments, toward institutions, toward systems that now control a larger share of resources. And that changes the balance, because instead of individuals making independent decisions, more control becomes centralized, more dependent on policy, on structure, on approval. And over time, that shift in power starts to reshape the system itself. So the question isn't just, should we tax the highest earners more? It's deeper than that. It's about how much incentive matters, how much risk matters, and how much growth depends on what people are allowed to keep. Because changing the top of the system changes everything below it. And maybe the real question is this: how do you balance fairness without slowing the system that creates opportunity in the first place?